Hi, everyone. I'm Calvina Bostick, a partner in our New York office and member of the firm-wide Diversity Committee. On behalf of the Diversity Committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion with the Reverend James Lawson Jr., facilitated by LA partner Paul Sweeney. Reverend Lawson is a civil rights pioneer and lifelong champion of nonviolent resistance to oppression and injustice. He is often referred to as the mind of the movement and was described by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the leading theorist and strategist of nonviolence in the world. Indeed, he is. Thank you for joining us today, Reverend Lawson. It is truly an honor to have you with us.
My great pleasure.
Today marks the 8-month anniversary of our Conversation About Race series. The Diversity Committee launched this series to provide education on race and racism and its impact on society. The goal is to promote understanding, discussion, collaborative solutions, and action. Based on the level of engagement we've received thus far and feedback, I'm confident that our speakers have done just that. So far, we've heard from Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP, Dr. Harry Williams, President and CEO of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, the Honorable Bernice B. Donald, Judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, Sherry Beasley, former North Carolina Chief Justice, and Kevin Johnson, Dean of UC Davis School of Law. In connection with these discussions, the Diversity Committee has prepared reflection and discussion guides to help us all digest the lessons learned from each of the speakers and to foster dialogue and action. There is no better person to continue this series than Reverend Lawson, given all that he has done on the front lines to change America for the better. With that, I'll turn it over to Paul to begin this exciting discussion.
Thank you very much, Callie, and welcome, Reverend Lawson. This is going to be a discussion of Reverend Lawson's journey from student to American civil rights icon. And I hope that by the time we are finished with our discussion, that the viewers will understand that Reverend Lawson's journey is an integral part of America's journey down the long and winding road towards racial justice and equity. So with that, I'll get started. By the way, I should mention that Reverend Lawson and I know each other. We go way back. And so it's good for me personally to be able to have this conversation with him. So Reverend Lawson, I'll start off asking you about a few background questions, just so that we can understand how you got to where you are today, that is, from a young child to a student of the movement to actually an architect of the movement. And we'll talk a little bit about where we go from here. But let me start by asking you, I know that you were born in Pennsylvania, you grew up in Ohio, and I want you to tell us a little bit about your childhood and whether there were things that happened to you in those early days that got you to start thinking about racial injustice in the U.S.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Paul, for having this session with me. I think there are two important features about my childhood in Ohio. From age 4 on, my father was a second-generation Methodist clergy person, and he was assigned when I was 4 years of age, to the St. James AME Zion Church in Massillon, Ohio. He was appointed by his bishop, which was the church way of organizing itself in those days, and still is in many ways. So I arrived on Tremont Street, Parsonage, at age 4 in Massillon, Ohio. And perhaps the most important feature of my childhood is the fact that I grew up with a deep sense of being who I am and who I was, a deep sense of belonging to a community. The St. James AME Zion Church was my first sense of belonging to a people. It was a wonderful congregation from my point of view. And my parents were staunch people of the Christian faith, followers of Jesus, they would say, actively committed to the eradication of every form of racial prejudice. So in that early childhood, I had a profound sense. I could not have described it then, but I had a profound sense of my own belonging, of my being alive and well, and also safe. I had no sense of being under threat. But the second most important thing of my life as a youngster is this. At age 4, I think it's in the street, Tremont Street, which was a very largely desegregated community. That is, there were more whites on the 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 blocks around my house and also around the church than there were black people. But there were black houses and white families and black families living on the same block in about probably at least a 5-block area that I can see and visualize right now. And we all played together before school. We went to the same school, Lauren Andrew School, about 4 or 5 blocks away from where I lived, was a school that began age 1st grade through the 9th grade. So the folk in that neighborhood, we all went to that same school. Black people were probably a small minority. Later, I learned not more than about 10% of Massillon, Ohio. But on the street, Tremont Street, as I recall, this boy who was one of our playmates, one of the playmates on fishing in a creek that ran parallel to Tremont Street, going up to the railroad track and the bridge across the Tuscarawas River. This was a youngster, we were, and he was probably 4 or 5 years of age. Suddenly, in our play that day, and just the 2 of us were there, and I don't know what we were playing even, but suddenly he calls me a racist name. I don't know where that came from, but I felt the hostility of that name, and I tried to fight the boy at age 4.
And when you go ahead.
Could not explain that to you at age 4. But from age 4 to 8, when I met racist epithets, mostly on the street or in the parks, and it's strange that I never heard a racist epithet directed towards me in a classroom or at recess on the playing fields of Lauren Andrews or later Longfellow, later the high school. It always occurred either in the park, one of the city parks, or just simply on the street. So this is my first experience. I fight him. We were not allowed in our family to use racist, angry epithets towards one another or towards anybody else. So that much I recall.
Okay, let me ask you this. So you thought about fighting him, and obviously you determined that that probably was not the right thing to do. But didn't there come a time when you actually were called a name at some point? Maybe this is in elementary school, and you literally slapped the child?
those instances did occur more than once on the streets of Massillon, Ohio, to me personally, and to also my brothers and sisters. I don't remember ever having a conversation in our home about that, but I don't remember ever talking to my parents and family at the dinner table about it either. I'm in the fourth grade. It's the spring of my fourth grade. My parents have bought a home on the other side of town, at 33 Bruce Avenue, and I'm going to Horseman Elementary School. I rush home on a beautiful spring day. My mother greets me in the kitchen where she's already preparing the evening meal, and she immediately advises me I want to run an errand, Jimmy. So I go out the back door again. I run up to downtown Massillon, Ohio, Main Street, make a left turn onto Main Street, going then east. And at the curve on this beautiful day, there's a car parked with all the windows down. And a white child is in that car. As I approach the car going on the sidewalk, this child stands up in the seat and puts his head out of the window and arms outside the window and yells a racist epithet at me. I'm in a hurry, but I walk over to the child. I slap the child. I slap that person. Run on up the street, finish my errand, come back the same way. I notice that that car is now gone. But I head on home, run through the back porch and into the kitchen. And after reporting the errand results to my mother, I sit in the chair and we talk. And this is the one and only time that I recall where I connected a slapping incident over a racist epithet to either parent. And my mother does not turn away from the stove where she's working with her back facing the opposite wall, and I see her side. And she says without hesitation, quietly, Jimmy, what good did that do? And that for me became a climatic experience where I determined in the midst of her voice, I would no longer hit and strike and fight. When a racist epithet were heard on me, I would resist another way. I would no longer lose my temper on a playing field and fight with my fist. And then I remember clearly the second question that she asked me, which not second question, her final sentence was, Jimmy, there must be a better way. I heard myself saying there has to be a better way, and I will find that better way. So that's when I put down my fist and determined that I would be trying to operate by a different way. And I operated from that time onward, actually out of my sense of the love of God and the teachings of Jesus, which my mother mentioned in her long soliloquy to me. So I began to experiment. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you decided that you were going to try and figure out a better way.
Exactly.
And so by the way, let me point out that we're talking about the 1930s now.
That's
and right. And now we're starting to move towards the 40s. And when you got to high school, did you continue to experience these kinds of racial incidents where epithets were hurled at you. By the way, you were in the North. We're not even talking about being in South.
No,
South of
sorry.
this,
We're
in the
talking.
North.
By this time, racism is a national issue. The South may have been the more thoroughly segregated area, and also had laws that demanded segregation. But racism by this time is all over the country. I mean, I get refused service in a restaurant in my own hometown while I'm in high school. I get refused service there. My first sit-in was in a lunch counter, a drugstore lunch counter in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm in either high school or second year of college. The summer of 47, the December of 47, my high school debate partner, Chuck Soner, and we go into a dining car on Main Street, Massillon, Ohio, to talk and visit together, and we are not served. And we spend about an hour to 2 hours there talking to the manager, who refuses to serve us because Chuck is white, I'm black. So he will not serve us. No matter that long conversation with him, he would not serve us. There was no law in Ohio.
Well, what was your reaction to that? I mean, this must have been humiliating to you. You had the discussion.
No. It wasn't.
Oh.
No. Chuck was more outraged than I was. As friends, he was more outraged than I was. I saw it instead as another opportunity for me to learn what this business of racism is about. How subtle it is, how nuanced it is. So this is all in Ohio. I learned of Jim Crow law and segregation in the black newspapers and from my parents. My father, when I was in elementary school, showed me the gun that when he was appointed to a church in Anniston, Alabama, he carried that weapon by train to Anniston, Alabama on the weekends when he went there to serve the congregation and would return home on Monday or Tuesday in Massillon, Ohio. So
because he believed he needed a weapon to protect himself.
Yeah, as I remember, he said to me, because I'm going to be a man no matter what, and I may need a weapon to do that. That's what I remember from my elementary school area conversations with my father about this.
Let's move on to your time once you reach college. I believe it was
put in the point, Paul.
Yeah,
because
sure, go ahead.
By the time I hit high school, I was already persuaded that I was called to become a pastor of a church. That to be ordained in the Methodist tradition and to pastor. By the time I reached high school, I also was committed to the notion that I would obey no forms of racist law. I would not obey under any circumstances racism. Then after my first year in high school, I met religious bigotry in high school. Bigotry against Jewish students, and I swore that I would be opposed to every form of religious bigotry and prejudice and despising of people. Then I met also Protestant prejudices against Roman Catholics. All of us students in high school, you see, and I determined again. So my recognition of these ways of disputing the humanity of people had increased. So by the time I left high school, I was opposed to every form of religious bigotry and every form of racist fear and prejudice. Had a deep commitment to being anti-law when law was unjust. I think this is important in the law firm. Law must be just. Law must be accessible. Law must be applied fairly and with wisdom.
Indeed.
And so,
well, let's talk a little bit about your college days and how your sense of justice and not abiding by injustice was further developed. I know that you attended lectures and you got involved in things. Tell us a little bit about that in college.
well, 1947, I started my first year of college. And the most important event in that freshman year was the fact that a man by the name of A.J. Musty, who then was the executive director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, was invited by our history department to lecture over a couple of days. And all of us in history classes were essentially told, this is homework. You have to be at those lectures. And so I went. A.J. Musty reminded me in his speech, in his lecture, of Gandhi and what Gandhi accomplished in India by 1947. That is the independence of India from the British colony, from the British Empire, without firing a shot. No British soldiers or officials were shot or killed. Gandhi did it essentially through nonviolence. Now, to my best of my knowledge, that's where I began to hear and see the word nonviolence. And so I went on and bought Gandhi's autobiography, I went to the library rather, and found the autobiography of Gandhi. Later I purchased it, but I read then in conjunction with my learning process, I read Gandhi's autobiography. And then I knew that my own religious background made me a nonviolent practitioner. A.J. Musty was the director of the largest ecumenical pacifist organization in the country, and I joined it that very week on a membership form that A.J. Musty carried with him as a part of the stuff he carried with him as he lectured around the country. So that began then my reading of Gandhi and my recognition that Gandhi, in a very real way, was showing us how there is a science of social change. There is a science of personal and social change where we do not have to imitate the evil in the world, but we can try to overcome and change the evil, both in ourselves and in our community. So that became a lifelong examination of nonviolence.
At that time, were you thinking at all about maybe applying nonviolent principles to the injustices that Black people were facing in America?
That was the beginning. That was the beginning. And it should be said that from my practice of nonviolence on a personal basis and all, that began in 47. Well, it actually began before 47, but 47 I began to call it nonviolent struggle. And from that time on, I knew that nonviolence was a way to go after racism. By the time I left college in 1952, I was convinced that we Black people would have a nonviolent movement that would change the country forever. I knew
So,
this by 1952, and I knew I would be involved in it. I did not know what that would be or where it would occur or who would be engaged in it, but I knew that we black folk were going to have a major campaign that would move towards the ending of segregation law and segregation and racism in the United States.
well, now I know at some point soon thereafter, you wound up moving to India. And tell me about your decision to move to India and not necessarily move south or address the issues of segregation in the US.
Well, I knew I eventually would be living in the South of the United States, but in preparation for that, I decided it was important for me as a follower of Jesus to know what that looked like, not in the United States, but in Africa or in Asia. So by the time I was finishing my senior year in college, I had applied and been accepted by the United Methodist Church and its board of ministry to go overseas to teach, because they were sending young men and women fresh out of college to be teachers of English in Japan, Korea, and Africa, and so forth. So I originally signed up for a job in what is Harare, Mozambique, not Mozambique, but Harare, Zimbabwe. But I had sent my draft cards back because I could not cooperate with selective service. And so my career, my life in college was interrupted by a 3-year federal sentence to prison for committing the felony of disobeying selective service. For the members of your firm and all, the thing to think about here is Muhammad Ali in the 60s, when he had the heavyweight boxing crown taken away from him because he would not take the oath to enter the armed forces. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court. He said he had a religious exemption. They said you're A1, which was the classification. So Muhammad Ali was able to take his case all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, I think, maybe unanimously voted that he, as a black Muslim and a black minister of the black Muslim tradition, was exempt. So the Supreme Court exonerated him. It was one of the most famous legal cases in the world because, stripped of his heavyweight boxing crown, he became a popular speaker in colleges all around our own country and elsewhere, and spoke, and lectured on his philosophies and on the way he looked at life. Muhammad
So
Ali.
when you were in India, did you study further and learn a
Yes.
lot more
So
about
yes,
nonviolence?
while in jail, the opportunity to go to India and as a coach and phys ed teacher and campus minister came at Hissel College in Nagpur, and I eagerly accepted it. And I did get a parole from the federal government after serving about 13 months of my 3-year sentence. And I could take my parole period, I could take it in, they gave me permission to go to India as an employee of the United Methodist Church, which I did. And I was eager to do it because I said I could continue my studies of Gandhi by talking to people in India who were with Gandhi, meeting some of his followers, reading books that were published in India, not in the United States, so Europe, on the Gandhian movements. So I continued my studies of nonviolence, both reading and watching in India itself. But the major point I would make is that by the time I finished college, I knew I wanted to go outside the United States and live for a period of time, just in order for me to understand my faith better and what it meant to be a follower of Jesus.
Well, there came a point in time, as I recall, when you were in India and you picked up a newspaper and you
That's right.
read about the Montgomery bus boycott in the U.S. That was around 1955. Tell us about what you read and how that impacted you.
Yes, my newspaper, the Nagpur Times, was an English uh, uh, newspaper in Nagpur, and I subscribed to it. So it was thrown into my porch every morning. And I'm at my desk in my apartment when the paper comes, and I go pick it up and bring it to my desk, and I open it. And there on the front page of the Nagpur Times, in the middle section, um, is the story Negroes in the United States. I don't remember the exact headline, boycott. And I shouted. I was elated. And it was one of the finest days of my life because what I had realized was going to happen had begun. It was the Montgomery boycott. And this is where I read first the name Martin Luther King Jr. and the bus boycott. So what I knew was going to happen now took specific, concrete form. A bus boycott. Boycott is a tactic of nonviolence. Economic boycotts, bus boycotts, which I used later in the South, of course, as well. So it was one of the high moments of my time in India. And I told my next door neighbor that when I returned to the United States in '56, that I would become involved in that struggle. That was my long calling.
Well,
I
let's
did not
turn to
shake.
your.
I did not shake hands with Martin King until February the 6th, 1957.
Tell us about that encounter.
The bus boycott had just ended in January of 1957. I went, as I left India, I applied for graduate school of theology. And in order to be able to see more of my family, I applied and was accepted at the Oberlin Graduate School of Theology, which was about 30 miles away from Massillon, Ohio, which meant I could re-enter into my family's life and be visiting with sisters and brothers and my parents while in graduate school and re-entering into the family life. So Martin Luther King had been invited to speak at Oberlin College in the city of Oberlin with 3 lectures on February the 6th. And the YMCA campus director who had invited him and scheduled him made certain that he and I were going to be face to face by in feeding Martin. Harvey Cox, the YMCA director, had a small room in the student center where a handful of us could sit with Martin King and speak. I got to that room first. No one was in the room, but I heard a step at the door, and it was Martin King by himself. And I went back to the door and shook his hand, and we sat down and we had our first conversation. And he, of course, I told him I'd just come back from India 3 years, and he said he wished he could have taken that trip. Could have been in India. But then I said, well, when I finish my graduate degrees, I intend to move south. And so Dr. King said to me very quietly, come now, don't wait. We need you now. And then he talked to me about the fact that the emerging movement that occurred in the Montgomery bus boycott, that there was no one who had done that kind of work that I had done by this time, 1957. I've spent 10 years on my own researching and examining and practicing nonviolence all around the world.
Well, so that takes us to, and we've got some of our partners and attorneys from our new Nashville office, and I want to get to Nashville because I know that was the first of many efforts to desegregate after the Montgomery boycotts and the sit-ins that you organized. And so I want to ask you some things about that. You were in Nashville, and you and a group of other people decided that you were going to target the segregated facilities in Nashville, and you were going to desegregate them. Tell me what the discussion was about and the planning for that desegregation effort there.
Well, there are lots of preparation for it. Number one, I should say that when King said that I should come immediately, I said I would come as fast as I could. So I dropped out of graduate school and landed in Nashville as my choice as the Southern Secretary of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. This again comes back to 1947 and A.J. Musty. So I'm to run that Southern office. I am a troubleshooter. I become well acquainted with the Little Rock Nine that year. A marvelous, beautiful story, which should not be called Civil Rights Movement, but should be called the Little Rock Nine story. And it's about the desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock. Great piece of history. Anyway, I travel around the spots, trouble spots and hot spots at the South. By the time of by the time of September, August, September, I'm aware that there is real anxiety among many of us as to if the Montgomery bus boycott has happened 55 to 57, can it happen again? So I come back to I'm a member of a group of clergy and lay people in Nashville. Kelly Miller Smith was our chair, and I say to that executive committee, if we're going to have another example of how nonviolence works, we have to do it here in Nashville. And so we have a major discussion in October, November about this, and we agree we're going to plan a nonviolent campaign in Nashville. And we would begin January, and I would be the organizer and strategist for making it happen. So I try to organize it according to a nonviolent methodology out of Gandhi. From January of 59 to June, we do a thorough discussion of the plight of the Negro in Nashville. And out of that discussion, we decide, and Black women were a major part of that group that met every week for 6 months. We decide we are going to desegregate downtown Nashville. It's important for us to understand that the Nashville campaign was not a student campaign. The decision to desegregate downtown Nashville was the most significant strategic issue next to the important strategic decision on the part of the NAACP that they were going to take cases to court and get the Supreme Court to de-racialize the Constitution. Their major decision came out May 17th, 1954. The Bus Boycott began December the 1st, 1955. But the horror of segregation and racism, legal and by custom, that Black women felt in Montgomery was the hostility with which they were treated in downtown Montgomery, and by the bus drivers in particular, who were all white. And in Nashville, it's Black women who said to us, "You men don't know anything about segregation because we have to go into downtown to do our shopping." It was the major shopping area for everyone. And we cannot try on a hat. I'm dragging my 5-year-old boy with me to get him a shirt and shoes and stockings for school. I cannot try on the clothing for my 5-year-old boy. I have to take the clothing off the racks, go home. If they fit, good. If they don't fit, I have no way of taking them back and turning them in.
And this is because the store
The
managers
rigid,
said,
the rigid legal and custom of Jim Crow law and racism that is in hundreds of small and large cities from New Mexico to Florida or South Carolina. It is the area where the plantation owners and the Ku Klux Klan decided in the 1860s and 70s that there will be no Emancipation Proclamation, that the ex-slave is going to be re-subjugated in a rigid system of segregation and would not be allowed to work at certain kinds of jobs, no matter how skilled they were, would be a source of cheap labor. The Black chain gangs that I read about in school, high school, in the Black newspapers, were a direct product of that. This is what all across southeastern parts of South Central United States was a rule of evil law and unhuman custom and spirituality.
So you say that it was Black women who said,
Yeah,
these are
Black
the kinds
women
of
said,
things these are the
Black
kinds
women,
of things I'm experiencing.
I-
So let's do something about it.
yeah. I had no idea how carrying on that 6 months process. I had no idea what we could do in Nashville. How would we create a movement? It was largely the Black woman who influenced my mind and the meetings week after week, which convinced me that they were correct and they were pointing us in the right direction. And I remember to this day my feeling when we made the decision finally in June, we're going to desegregate downtown Nashville. I remember very clearly my sensibility. Now, how are we going to do that? No one had made that as a target, but that became then the second major strategy to fight Jim Crow law and racism. And we know now, I did not know this in 61, but we know now that in over 200 small and major cities of the Southeast and South Central, there were campaigns that pulled all the white colored signs down, or the no Mexican sign down, in Texas, for example, in New Mexico. And then also opened up the fact that Black people could work as bank tellers, could work as clerks in a department store, or a buyer for a department store, and all of that kind of stuff. In other words, the job scene also changed.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about what happens once you decide, all right, we're going to do this, we're going to launch, we're heading out to the local store, department stores. Tell us a
Right.
little bit about that.
Well, then I proceeded then to organize a strategy for doing this, and decided that we would use the sit-in as one demonstration. We would do economic boycott if we had to, with picket signs. We would have mass meetings, we would have marches, and whatever kinds of tactics we needed to use. But we would begin with the sit-in. And so we recruited people. I put a lot of emphasis upon recruiting high school and college people, because high school and college people have idealism, they have the physical energy, they also have the sense that we can make changes in the world. I can become this, I can become that, and this can happen. They are starting out their life journey, so they're not as stuck in responsibility and care. So we recruited. So the stories claim, well, this was a sit-in, this was a student meet. No, we recruited John Lewis. He was a student at ABC. Kelly Miller Smith recruited him. We recruited Diane Nash. She was at Fisk, and I recruited her through Paul. I can't think of Paul's last name now. And it's changed.
Let me ask you this, Reverend Lawson. Now, I put myself in that situation. I say, I'm a student, and Reverend Lawson's talking about nonviolence, and I got to worry about somebody spitting on me, calling me names, hitting me, and I'm not going to put up with that. So how do you convince these students that they should hold their temper, engage in nonviolence, not hit back, and go through with this? I would have been scared to death.
Well, but you're looking at it from California's point of view and not from Nashville's point of view. See, that's part of the issue. I mean, Diane was shocked by the segregation in Nashville, having been raised in Chicago.
Diane Nash.
Raised in Chicago. Diane Nash. John Lewis was raised in Troy, Alabama, and was determined that what he experienced as a boy in segregation and Jim Crow law and violence in Troy, Alabama, did not have to be, and that he was going to fight against it. So he wanted to do something about it. And so here's the issue, and here's some of the things I use. Jackie Robinson has desegregated baseball in 1947. Most people don't know that Branch Rickey of the Dodgers was a man of faith as well as Jackie Robinson was. Branch Rickey knew that if Jack Robinson acted like Jack Robinson acted like a UCLA great athlete that he was, he would be thrown out of baseball in the first month, and the desegregation process would end. So Branch Rickey knew this also, and said to Jackie Robinson, for the first year, You have to play basketball. You have to play baseball, and I'll play every player on the field. If you get spiked, you cannot spike back. If you get hit with a fastball, you cannot rush out to the mound with your baseball bat at the pitcher. You have to take it. And you have to fight back by being the best player you can be. And you have to manage your anger and your frustration. Because one incident of you reacting to a racist affair on the field, and the National Baseball League will terminate your role and kick you out of the league.
And so that's essentially what you were saying. That's essentially what you were saying to these students.
Exactly. Little Rock 9, when I met them the first time in early January of 1958, I asked them what they were putting up with, and they told me about the hostility, the being pushed and shoved and being bombed and all that kind of stuff. I said, what did your parents and the lawyers tell you about going into school? They said we could not fight back. I said, what your parents and the lawyers meant is not that you cannot fight back, but you cannot fight back like the racists fight you.
Well,
and I said, they don't mean don't fight back, because if you do not resist in your character, in your mind, in your heart, your aspirations, you could hurt your lives. You could hurt your personality. You have to resist the evil that you're facing, but you have to do that. You can do that nonviolently more effectively than you can by calling people dirty names, cussing people out, or throwing a book at people. And they got it.
Very clearly, they got it because it worked. I was surprised at how quickly, I mean, I thought we were talking about years, but after your sit-in campaign started in downtown Nashville, what was it, 2 or 3 months when the department stores acquiesced and decided to desegregate the lunch counters?
We had our first sit-ins in restaurants and lunch counters February 13th, I think. May 10th, in those department stores and in 5 and 10 cent stores, the counters served the first Black people. The signs had come down, white colored signs, the renovations of restrooms, the signs over water fountains all had come down. And so May 10th was actually the day then that in Nashville, signs had come down in many places, and then Black people were being served. We did it in a reserved way, planned fashion. But after the first week, the merchants felt that everything was so smooth that we didn't have to worry about anything else. And so we proceeded without any more planned change.
Well, and we know that what happened in Nashville served as a model for desegregation of many
downtown
major
areas.
cities.
That's right. One scholar now tells me that this happened in more than 200 cities. I know that by September, the Southern Regional Council put out a report on the sit-ins, and they said that in over 100 cities, the signs of segregation had come down and been removed, and that Black people were being served in the downtown areas. So in over 200 cities, such campaigns went on. Those campaigns probably went on for 2 or 3 years. Then in 1964, our movement nonviolent movement had reached the kind of power that Congress, under the presidency of Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which made such signs illegal. And I want to point out that those signs were all across America. They were not just in a restaurant or a department store. There were
And when
signs.
we're talking about signs, we're talking about signs that say no blacks can
That's
use
right.
this water fountain, no blacks
No,
can use this bathroom.
okay, but even more than that, we're talking about San Clemente, California, where there was a sign in the 60s still, no Jew allowed in San Clemente. Just north of us, um, um, a suburb of LA, where there were signs no Negro allowed after dark in Glendale, I think it is. I can't think. And no Jew sign there. So we're talking about no dirty Irish signs in England, in New England. We're talking about no WAP signs, no Jap signs, no Mex signs in Texas and New Mexico. See? So we're talking about a pattern of law and custom that had extended this right of a drugstore or a city hall to have who could enter and who could not enter. Those signs became unconstitutional across the country. This is part of the unwritten history of the movement.
Well, indeed. And we know that from your Nashville sit-ins and the desegregation of other major cities in the South and the signs coming down, and we know about the March on Washington, et cetera. I tell you, I'm looking at our clock and we're coming to an end here, but there is so much more that I'd love to talk to you about, and you have been so gracious in sharing with us your experience. And like I said, it really is an American experience. And I will personally thank you, as I have done many times before, for all you have done to lead us. And when I say us, I'm talking about Americans to a more just and equal society. I know we've got a long ways to go, but you've helped us a long ways to getting there. Final question for you, because we do have a couple of minutes. So you know where we are today. It looks like racism is rearing its ugly head, or at least it may have been dormant for a while, but it has awakened with a vengeance. Where do we go from here?
Well, obviously, having lived in the 40s as well as the 1990s as well as 2020, I know that far more progress has been made than what people know about it. The nonviolent movement of America between 1953 to 73 is what is being resisted in some of the forces that have come to the surface. But we are experiencing 2020 the largest nonviolent demonstration in the history of the country in Black Lives Matter. They 97% nonviolent, according to the scholarly studies of campaigns and movements in the United States. They have occurred in over 8,000 demonstrations affecting 15 to 25 million people. They've been in more than 2,500 locations around the country. They have involved a great diversity And they are pushing on one of the deep issues of racism, namely how racism has been enforced through violent structures and through the personal violence of the KKK, the lynching, the history of lynching, and now through the police killing of black people and brown people around the country. The police using violence for a traffic stop.
Well,
So,
uh,
where do we go from here? Two things I want to say. One, each one of us can determine that we're going to be a lover of life, our own life, our neighbor's life, that we will not put up with any form of hatred and despising of other human beings for any reason. And secondly, we can work to be supportive of those struggles, those organizations, those places in our own cities where we know there is effort being made to continue dismantling of the evil, racism and sexism and violence and plantation capitalism, and where people are committed to having a new Los Angeles, a new Pittsburgh, a new Atlanta.
well, thank you very, very much for that, Reverend Lawson. I am optimistic as you, and we're doing it the nonviolent way. And I thank you profusely again for your taking the time to meet with us and sharing with us our history, not only your history, but our history. So thank you very much again, and I'll see you soon.
Okay, you're welcome, Paul.